Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to make a second attempt to make this program, and I hope it goes well. I'm out in the country where internet connection can be troublesome, but let's hope for the best. And tonight's program is called Illustration Art During the Roaring '20s, and I'm going to feature in the images I present Salmagundi artist, ad men, and storytellers. Not everyone that I picture is a former member of the club, but most are, and I'll recognize them, and you can recognize them too, because I have behind their names MOC, member of club. My name is James Thompson, and I'm the host, tonight's host. I'm a member of the Salmagundi Club. I've been a member for a couple of years. I think I'm an associate non-resident member. I'm not exactly sure what the classification is, but it's a delight to be a member of the club. And I'm sorry I don't get into New York that often, but when I do, I always come to the club. Before starting, I'd like to thank Elizabeth Spencer, who's the president of the club. I'd like to thank Alexander Kaplan, who's the club historian. I encourage you to do a search online. You can find some of his works there, and you can learn about the history of the club, which is quite fascinating. And I'd like to thank Bonnie Seiler, who is the chairman of the program committee, and she's responsible for putting this program together. Jean-Pierre, I'd like to thank you too for all the support that you're providing. So before I begin, I would like to introduce myself and give you a little understanding of why I'm talking to you this evening. I was born in Wilmington, Delaware, and I took art lessons as a child at the Delaware Art Center, which is holds the foremost collection of Howard Pyle paintings and has a wonderful collection of illustrations by his prize students. Also, as an aside, my grandparents lived on Green Hill Avenue. I used to go there and thumb through illustrated classics that were in their library. They lived right across the road from what had been in the 1860s Green Hill Farm, and that was the home of Howard Pyle at that time. So from a childhood, I've been familiar with the illustration art, and I've always loved it. A few years ago, I wrote these two books. You can see the covers, Painting America's Portrait. The first volume is How Illustrators Created Their Art, and the second volume deals with how illustrators created America. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the information that I presented in these books by way of background, so that you can understand that the art of the golden age of illustration, which was 1880 roughly to 1920, set the stage in an important way for the art that I'm discussing in this program. So before I begin, I'd like to also thank Jordan Berman, who is the founder and proprietor of the Illustrated Gallery. The Illustrated Gallery is one of the premier collections of illustration art, I think, in the world. It's a large, beautiful collection that Jordan assembled over several years. You can see it, all of the artists that he has in the collection at www.illustratedgallery.com. I encourage you to go there and view these pictures. Jordan was kind enough to create the Illustrated Gallery Press, which published my two books. So thank you, Jordan, and I encourage you all to take a look at his collection. Now, moving on to the program, I'd like to begin by giving some background. As I say, the golden age of illustration was between 1880 and 1920. There may be some discussion about whether those dates should be modified, but for our purposes, they're suitable. And during this time, as I will explain in a in the next couple of minutes, all of the artistic and technical requirements to make illustration art successful and to convey the motion and emotion they were trying to convey, all of these things were accomplished between 1880 and 1920. The second part of my background deals with incorporating psychology into these pictures, which made them even more powerful. And I'll give you examples of this. Here is the first slide, and I'm portraying, giving these two instances of an artist who succeeded in creating motion and emotion in his pictures. These illustrations were both created, as you see, by N.C. Wyeth. I have two of them for this reason, that the first one is the one on the right, the hunter, which Wyeth created in 1907. And the second one is an illustration for Robin Hood, which Wyeth created in 1917. Look at the colors in the first picture. The hunter is composed, he was working from a palette of earth colors that he learned about and created while studying with N.C. Wyeth in Wilmington. And in 1907, he was still working in his Wilmington studio, which was comparatively dark and cloistered. The pictures, this picture was painted with umbers and ochres and siennas and other flat earth colors. But that was the state of the art in 1907. And Wyeth, there was no reason for Wyeth to go beyond that. In 1908, Wyeth moved to Chaddsford, Pennsylvania. Some of you have probably been to his studio there. And if you go out to Chaddsford, even today, you see it's a brilliant, light setting of rolling landscapes and beautiful trees. And Wyeth began to after he made the move and settled himself in this new environment, he began to evolve his palette. And the picture on the left shows, I think, that he had added certain key colors to his palette. Colors like a rose madder, alizarin red, alizarin crimson, cadmium yellow, and permanent blue. And they allowed him to romanticize his pictures in a way that after 1908, printers and publishers could duplicate. And they could duplicate these colors with, by the middle of the 1910s, with pretty much absolute accuracy. And not only that, they could print them in large print runs without destroying the original source image. So bear in mind as we talk through this program that artists during the Golden Age modified their art, their methods, and their styles to keep up with advancing reproduction technologies. Here is a quick picture of a slide. In the beginning, what we're looking at is around the 1880s. Howard Pyle was producing pictures like this one, which was an illustration for his Robin Hood book. He was as successful as an author as he was as an illustrator. And you can see here that he's following more or less the etching methods used by Albrecht Dürer in the late 1500s and early 1600s. But by the end of the Golden Age, printers and publishers were able to produce pictures like Dean Cornwell's. This is an illustration for let me just get to the right page. This was for an illustration published for a story that was published by Hearst Magazine in 1921, and the story was called The Torrent, and it ran through several issues, and I never did find this particular picture, but it was done for this purpose. It's currently in the gallery of it's in the illustrated gallery, and so I put it in as a good example. Now, what I'd like to do is spend a couple minutes talking about the last great advance in technology that took place during the golden age of illustration. For artists who are participating in this evening's program, you're familiar with the CIM coloring scheme. It's amazing that these four colors, yellow, magenta, and cyan, when blended together, can produce the full spectrum of natural light. And this was done in photographs after the turn of the century. French technologists were leading this, but after the turn of the century, they learned how to colorize film and capture all of the elements, all of the colors of natural light in their film. And so by 1910, the issue was separating the colors out of the negative and reproducing it on the printed page. And I would like to just take a minute, and I think it's so important, it's so fascinating how this was done that I'm going to, I hate to read, but let me just read this so that you all understand in the clearest possible way how this technology worked. To colorize a printing plate, a color filter was placed in front of the negative. Shining a light through the negative and the color filter replaced the filter's color with its complement. A red filter screens out the red in the negative. The positive image on the red plate, printed plate, therefore contains red's complementary color, which is cyan. A green filter screens out the green and replaces it with the green's complementary color, which is magenta. A blue filter screens out the blue. The positive image on the blue print surface contains blue's complementary color, which is yellow. A black and white screen increases image contrast. Where color corrections were necessary, stippled dots were added by hand to clarify or highlight murky areas. The four colorized printing plates were then processed in four separate print passes. Each pass, the next primary color is overprinted on the print surface, and as the colors are added, the reproduced image becomes more colorful. When all the colors have been overprinted, the printed or positive image has the same colors as the image on the source negative. And the term color separation is used to refer to the printing process and to the images produced in the process. So this was the state of the art when the Great War began. And I want to take a minute now and talk about a great important development in illustration art that took place during the Great War. This was called euphemistically pictorial publicity. So let me just give you a time frame here of how this unfolded, the march of events. On April 2nd, 1917, Woodrow Wilson declared war on Germany. He had campaigned in the fall before on a platform of keeping America out of the European war, but because of aggression by the Germans sending U-boats to sink American shipping, he was finally obliged to enter the war. And shortly after he did, he wrote a letter to a man named George Creel, who was one of his most loyal supporters. And he told Creel, it's not an army that we must shape and train, it's a nation. A week after he declared war, President Wilson named George Creel to head his new Committee on Public Information. And Creel, shortly thereafter, sent a telegram to the Dean of American Illustration at that time, Charles Dana Gibson, and asked him to form a committee of artists to help him with pictorial publicity. Charles Dana Gibson was the right man for this job because he had been for many years the president of the Society of Illustrators, uptown in New York. He was a member of the Salmagundi Club, and he was an active illustrator himself for Life magazine, and he was a dedicated supporter of Wilson's policy to end the war, to end all wars. And so Gibson immediately set about building the division of pictorial publicity, and he worked closely with Creel to do this. Now, Creel, a few more comments. Wilson was concerned that opposition to the war would impede his efforts to build public support for the great mission that he had set the American nation to accomplish. And he was all set to impose a set of restrictions on speech and censor public communication. But Creel advised him not to do that. And he advised him to flood the airways with positive publicity. And Creel characterized his approach as expression, not suppression. And Wilson should do this, Creel explained, with propaganda, which he defined as gathering and disseminating facts for the purpose of propagating truth among the faithful. So the Department of Pictorial Publicity was a propaganda arm that supported a legion of that Creel created. He called the Minutemen. And these were prominent citizens that went out across the country and gave 1-minute speeches in support of various aspects of the war effort, an attempt to rally public support and unify the public in support of the war. Now, this is a great picture. It's from the, I think I got this picture from the Society of Illustrators, and it shows the leadership of the Department of Pictorial Publicity, and it highlights 6 members of the Salmagundi Club. Of course, the central figure is Charles Dana Gibson, who's the chairman of the committee, and working from, on his left is a man named DeSales Casey. DeSales Casey was the director of art for Collier's magazine, one of the most successful glossy weekly magazines. And as such, he knew all of the best artists in the country. The two of these men worked every day with, between them, worked every day with the best men. And they recruited 400 of these artists to create propaganda art, which was mainly the posters that accompanied and supported the Minuteman speeches that were being conducted everywhere across the country every day. And so we see here Jack Sheridan on next to Casey is Adolf Treidler. Both of these men made several propaganda posters. There's Harry Townsend and Charles Falls. Both of these men also made posters, but Townsend and Wallace Morgan were recruited into the artist regiment that went to France with the AEF, and they performed a different form of art development on behalf of the war, and I'll go into that in just a second. The departments of publicity, pictorial publicity's overarching theme was unity. And we see examples here of the kind of pictures that Americans' best illustrators created to promote the idea that everyone should contribute their particular skills and genius to the war, and that by working together, America would win the war. And of course, both the picture on the left here, the picture in the center, are both products of artists who are members of the club. The one on the right was done by James Montgomery Flagg. Flagg was probably the most prolific propagandist making more posters than anyone else. And this is a fine example of how we, together we win. Most of you know his famous picture, Uncle Sam Wants You. I'll mention a little bit more about that in a minute. There were three forms of propaganda art, or three forms of wartime art. One illustration, one example is the propaganda art as pictured on the left. This was by J.C. Leyendecker, who I'll go into in more detail, discuss in more detail in a minute. And this was done, these posters were presented everywhere across the country in windows plastered on walls, and they were, as I say, selling the war to the American people. The center picture is an illustration by Harvey Dunn, also a member of the club. And Harvey Dunn was one of the 8 artist illustrators who went to France with the American Expeditionary Force, and he created beautiful, fascinating illustrations of what actually happened. The artists in the field were reporting and recording what the Army was doing on the front and how they would rest in camp and other things like that for historical purposes. The picture on the right was done by F.C. Jan, another member of the club. This is a famous picture called The Last Night of the War. I don't have time to go into a lot of details about it, but it's an example of the artists illustrate the ad men and storytellers who were telling the American public, giving the American public updated information about what the boys were doing in great moments of the war. So moving on, there were 3 forms of propaganda art. The first and foremost was directed at the young men and women who could serve in the either armed forces or in the service organizations that supported the armed forces. And this is the center picture is by Howard Chandler Christy, who was another very active propagandist on behalf of the war. I chose this picture by Christy instead of Uncle Sam Wants You, which most of you recognize, because Christy, as I say, was a member of the club and Flag wasn't. The picture on the left is a war poster created by Edward Penfield. Penfield, for many years, was the art director for Harper's Magazine and is sometimes referred to as the father of American posterism. And many of you know he made hundreds of poster covers for Harper's Magazine, and they're fascinating, large, flat fields of color, minimum detail, but suggestive. He's got the characteristics, the movement and the emotion captured in an economy of lines and colors. And on the right is another of Wyeth's pictures, and this one is to a picture that was really intended to boost morale. You know, there were a lot of dark moments during the war, and Americans needed to know that they had to be strong to face the trials and tribulations and the news they faced every day. And this is an example of that genre of the propaganda art. So all this is developing. America's artist illustrators are mastering the text. Americans were venting their anxieties, finally getting over the suppression of their desire to live normal lives and to pursue their happiness. And this picture captures that. It's by George Luck's famous picture. George wasn't a member of the club. You can find information about this piece online. I think it's in the collection of the Whitney Museum in New York. Terrific painting. But once the celebration was over, Americans were ready to move on with their lives. And this was the beginning, this marked the beginning of a decade-long party, which we know today as the Roaring '20s. And this party, fascinating, it was a fascinating cultural event that was supported by the America's artist illustrators, who were moving out of the Department of Pictorial Propaganda back into their commercial lives, selling things and illustrating stories. This is a terrific expression of the moment. The picture's done by John Held, who was the flapper artist, and he captured perfectly the spirit of the 20s. And underneath this picture, there was a surging economy, and that funded mass consumerism and a cultural revolution that featured built on self-gratification. And that's what Held is illustrating in this picture. So I'm going to look a little bit into these characteristics of the Roaring Twenties. And what I want to point out is that the artists who were picturing America and selling Americans' products and dreams in the 1920s were the same men that had the same skills that had sold the war a few years before. And this is an example, terrific picture. It's property of the Society of Illustrators. It's done by Henry Patrick Raleigh, who was kind of his specialty was portraying the wealthy and the well-to-do living the best possible types of lives. And here we have Americans dressing up, going out, and pretending they're rich and beautiful. The picture on the left of this screen shows a piece by Raleigh, a war poster that he did in 1918. So let's look now at the characteristics of the artists and the art they produced during the Roaring Twenties. This is a great picture. It's the property of the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. That's a wonderful museum, and many of you have probably been there. I encourage you to go. But they've graciously given me permission to reproduce this picture, and it shows two men who were neighbors in the famous New Rochelle community of illustrators that thrived after the war. And of course, the man on the left is J.C. Leyendecker, and the man on the right is his friend and not really his protege, but they traded information and thoughts about art, and that's Norman Rockwell. And so Leyendecker was a stylist, and he had been trained in France. He had been working for decades selling fashion, selling the collars and suits to the best dressed American men. Rockwell, on the other hand, was a storyteller, and he had been trained in New York and had a natural gift. And so these two men became famous and established their leadership in the art of illustration during the 1920s. And in the course of their careers, between the two of them, they produced about 650 covers for the Saturday Evening Post, which was America's most popular weekly. Now, during the war, these two men they fell in and were doing war-related propaganda. And these are three illustrations of covers that they produced in that enterprise. We see here on the left that Leyendecker is still stylish and precise. He's using the techniques that made him successful as a commercial artist before the war. After the war, the artistic styles of these two leaders of the illustration community changed a little bit, but not that much. In the post-war magazine covers, we see the stylist on the left, and we see the storyteller on the right. What I want to describe now, these two men set the boundaries, in a sense, for the art during the Roaring '20s. And this was a new form of art, and I call it victory art for the sake of distinction. And let's take a look at, it's an expression of a new frame of mind, a new artistic frame of mind. And I say that because the Americans, fresh and strong, had answered the call and had won the war. And America's illustrators were proud of the part they played in winning the war, having created all of these powerful posters that united the people and drew them into the support for the war. And after the war, they applied this positive frame of mind, they were masters of the universe, and they used it to portray art in a slightly new way. This picture here by N.C. Wyeth was for the Old Continentals. It was the frontispiece for a book that was published in 1922, and it draws on the war imagery that had been used in the 1918, 1917 period. And you can see in this case, the full colorization, the romanticism, the purples that Wyeth added to his art. But the victory art was portrayed a new theme, and it pictured what I think it pictured: vigor, strength, and confidence. Not that this particular cover illustrates that, but this was the Washington Post cover that J.C. Leyendecker did for the beginning. It set kind of a pattern that he followed for many years, decades after that, and he produced the cover portrait for the Saturday Evening Post's first issue of the new year. And what they were doing was what Leyendecker and Rockwell were doing was portraying what it was to be an American. And we'll see that here in a second. The two branches of illustration art during the Roaring '20s were advertisements and telling stories. And the artists who were producing these images to sell products and to tell stories were using psychology, the techniques they'd learned and the methods that they'd cultivated during the war to create demand. They were both masters of both the Leyendecker and Rockwell were masters at doing this, and Leyendecker used it to market the American dream, and Rockwell used it to market being an American. So let's look at a couple of examples of post-war art. These are typical of Leyendecker. There's no real story here. What he's doing is portraying, Leyendecker's portraying winners. His characters were stylish, prosperous, and smart. And he suggested in these pictures that all proper American males were supposed to be like this. They were supposed to be well-dressed and spend their time at the races or skiing or something. And in this sense, he portrayed and encouraged Americans to follow their dreams and to be good consumers. Rockwell didn't do too many ads, but he did do some ads. And these are two great ones. GE hired him in the '20s to create images for an ad campaign for Mazda electric lamp. And Rockwell attracted an audience by portraying images of kindly characters doing familiar things. So these were the two boundaries that most American illustrators followed during the '20s. Here's another example. Samuel Nelson Abbott had been a in-house artist for Hart, Schaffner, and Marx. And before the war, he had developed this idea of a catalog of stories. The art books that were presented by Hartz, Schaffner, and Marx would focus on a football game or on a race or on a parents' day at school, something like that. And all of the dress, all of the clothing that its people wore were arranged around that theme. And so we see in this picture, which appeared in the Saturday Evening Post in 1921, a kind of a combination of the stylishness that Leyendecker characterized Leyendecker's work and the storytelling that characterized Rockwell's work. And this is another example. Now we're moving to a new artist, Mead Shaffer, terrific artist, he was commissioned to paint several ads for Packard cars. And this picture here is in the Illustrated Gallery collection. It's a terrific painting of consumers, a wealthy man admiring a chair made by Duncan Fife. Again, this is what all good Americans, all prosperous Americans should be doing, buying fine products. And the Packard automobile was such a thing. And we see here on the right how the painting was incorporated into the advertisement. So it's kind of a variation of what Samuel Nelson Abbott was doing. And during the 1920s, something else began to emerge in the illustrated works, products, and stories, and that's sex. Up until prior to the war, women were housewives, and Charles Dana Gibson discovered the new woman, who was a careerist, and she was capable, independent, a leader in her own right, but she wasn't supposed to be a sex object. But we see here a very delicate movement into this forbidden area. The picture on the left is by Coles Phillips. He died young. I think he died only a year or two after this. And he's doing another Mazda lamp ad, and he's portraying a beautiful model who's turning on a light or looking out the window from a lighted room. The picture on the right, the ad on the right, is very interesting to me. There were a series of Palmolive ads that were done, and they were the Cleopatra pictures. Many of you have seen them, and it's kind of interesting. In this case, the foot pictures, the lower part of the ad was done. It was a kind of a stock piece. They were stock pieces done by Warren Baumgartner, and the individual, the lovely young lady at the mirror, is done. That's a rendering of a work by Rolf Armstrong, and so they're selling being appealing as a sexual object almost. I don't want to offend anyone, but this was beginning to occur during the Master of the Universe decade of the 1920s. Now, here's a picture that kind of gets off of that. I say this is an ad that is outside the boundaries I'm describing. It's an ad for Jell-O by Maxwell Parish, and Maxwell Parish, as many of you know, referred to himself as a businessman with a brush, and he was fabulously successful as an illustrator. Painted almost from the first picture he painted. He made buckets of money, and this ad portrays him as he was transitioning from his early fairy tale style into his mid-period daydream style. And so it has symmetry, and it refers to these somewhat comical characters, and it draws you in with its artistry. But this was as close as Maxwell Parish came to victory art, not really within the bounds, as I say, and one can say as a result that Maxwell Parish operated in his own realm, always successful, but independent. Now, moving away from the ads, let's turn to the storytellers. Of course, Norman Rockwell wasn't the only storyteller in the 1920s. And Rockwell portrayed Americana in a charming, avuncular way, anecdotal way. This picture is by Harvey Dunn. It's in the collection of a drugstore out in, I think it's South Dakota, called Wall's Drugs. Amazing picture, but Harvey Dunn used his art and his storytelling powers to take Americans into the gritty real world. So it's a contrast in that sense to what Rockwell was doing. So we'll move in that direction now. Americans, and when the war was over, were ready to get back to living an enjoyable life and pursuing their happiness. And among things, they were ready for glamour and adventure. So the artist storytellers, they took it upon themselves to use the skills that they developed and to provide images of glamour and to images of adventure. Here are two examples. The picture on the left is another of Henry Raleigh's works. It was in the collection of Walt Reed. It's subsequently been sold, and I don't know where it is now. This is one of the only pictures that I'm showing you tonight that I don't have a direct permission from. Roger Reed, Walt's son, has said that I could use it, but I'm not sure where the picture is. On the other hand, the picture on the right is another work by Dean Cornwell. Terrific picture. I found the magazine in which this painting was appeared as an illustration, and the illustration is the story is called A $2,000 Reward. The picture itself is in the collection in the Kelly collection in Great Falls, Virginia, and they've given me permission to use it. I love this picture, and of course it's very typical of Cornwell. There's lots of action. You're drawn in. What is this person doing? What happens to her? And in order to find out, of course, you have to read the rest of the story. So in that sense, he used his psychology to sell. Now, these are two more pictures from the Kelly collection. Both of them are by Mead Shaffer, who we saw a moment ago. And Mead Shaffer in the 20s concentrated on painting these kinds of realistic historical dramas. And both of these pictures are terrific. On the one on the left, a threesome hiding in an alleyway illustrates intrigue. He did that. He succeeded in doing that by posturing his figures in a certain way, by having certain expressions. They're exhibiting certain sentiments. The light is slanted. The coloring is special for stimulating drama. And so he was a master. And of course, the picture on the right, the Count of Monte Cristo, was done a couple of years later, but it uses the same techniques to highlight suspense. And here again, people that were reading these books and stories would see these pictures and they would want to know what happened next. This picture is by an artist named Daniel Content. It's in the collection of the Illustrated Gallery. Daniel Content was I think that he shared a studio with Mead Shaffer, and he was a student of Dean Cornwell, and he's not that well known. He eventually abandoned illustration art and became an advertisement or art director for one of the major advertising agencies. But he had the same ability to capture an emotion and motion in a moment that made you want to know what's going on? What is this girl saying? What's this man on the table? What's going to become of him? What's this other fellow thinking? And he was so good at illustrating it. It's a shame that he's not better known. And finally, or here we have a picture, another by Harvey Dunn, and this was expressing hate. And Harvey was such a great artist. There was no real limit to what his abilities were. And this was a book done by, published by a Philadelphia publisher, David McKay. And I know that some of you are going to wonder, what were women artists doing during this period? And David McKay highlighted several of the best Philadelphia women artists. Clara Peck comes to mind, and Elizabeth Shippen Green, and he produced books illustrated by these women who were fabulously successful during the golden age of illustration and continued to be successful, many of them for through the decade afterwards. And then not everything was a life-threatening moment for artist storytellers. I particularly like this picture on the left by Samuel Nelson Abbott. I have this picture, and I haven't framed it yet, but I love the flirtation, and the colors are wonderful, and the way he's postured them. It's just a pleasant interlude. And the picture on the right is Romance, and it was done by Saul Tepper, who was a student of Harvey Dunn's, and you can see color, posture, slanted lines, the use of light. All of this creates the emotion that the story is telling, and makes you want to understand what happened to them. And then I would just make the point that not all storytelling during the 1920s was about something big and dramatic. And these are two artists who concentrated on making everyday events interesting. The picture on the left is by an artist named Leslie Thrasher. Leslie Thrasher was a student of Pyle's, and many considered him to be a rival of Norman Rockwell. Unfortunately, his studio burned in 1936, and in the effort to save some of his pictures, he inhaled a great deal of smoke and died a few days after the fire from the effects of the smoke, pneumonia. This picture, it's very interesting. He invented really a new genre of storytelling. He painted I don't know, dozens of covers for Liberator magazine, and the pictures were pictures of his character, who's himself, and this woman is first begins as his girlfriend, and then as his fiance, and becomes his wife, and he tracks through their marriage. And each picture that he put on the cover of a Liberator magazine was a new episode, the next episode of their relationship through their marriage. So it was very, very fun to watch. It built quite an audience. And Jordan Berman has dozens of these pictures in his collection, so it's fun to see. The picture on the right is by E.M. Jackson. Jackson was, like many illustrators, was an architect, and he went from doing drawings, architectural drawings, to he eventually became a full-time illustrator, did 50 or 60 covers for the Saturday Evening Post. They're kind of Norman Rockwell-esque, portraying some humorous moment in everyday life. And this picture here is, I don't have the date of the Post cover where it appeared, but I'm sure it was that was what it was created for, and it's also in Jordan Berman's collection. So this storytelling and promoting, selling products and promoting the American dream continued for 10 marvelous years, and the masters of the universe were very successful. Many of them became quite wealthy. Men like Henry Raleigh, Norman Rockwell, J.C. Leyendecker were extremely successful and prosperous, but their reign ended on 27 October 1929 when the stock market crashed. This is a great picture. It was done by William Kemp Starrett, who was a illustrator for newspapers. And so he was knocking these things off in, several a day or dozens a week. And he's done a wonderful job in capturing the moment. But it was a terrible day and the beginning of a terrible period for illustration art. A lot of the men that you see eventually stopped producing illustrations and they went on to other things. But the best of them carried on. And so without much further ado, I'll just point out that the 19 Roaring 20s ended. And when they ended, a new chapter in American illustration began. This seems to me to be an apt image expressing the advance. Of course, a man that survived the turmoil, or an artist who survived the turmoil, was Norman Rockwell. This is a terrific picture. Everybody knows it. If you've been to the Nassau Inn and the bar room, the tap room of the Nassau Inn in Princeton, you've seen this. It's I think it's about 13 feet long by 8 feet high. And Rockwell painted it for one of the Princeton's wealthy alumni and gave this picture, who gave this picture to the college. And so I think it portrays, it insinuates the new age that's coming and confirms that Norman Rockwell led the way. So that's my last slide in this program. The rest of the slides, anybody that's interested that looks at this can go through the rest of the slides and they can see all of the citations and sources of these pictures. I always think it's important to know that, and it helps people understand, and they can go back and look at the source documents or where they were, and that makes the pictures more interesting, I think. So thank you, and if we have a few minutes, I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. Otherwise, thank you and good evening.